Bergen, winter 1876 to 1877. What a devilish cold, groaned Dr. Paweł Skórzewski, pulling the reindeer hide tighter around himself. He had been talking to himself for hours, unable to stop, just as he couldn't control his shivering. The other passengers in the sled-mounted carriage had long since stopped paying attention to the foreigner muttering under his breath. Outside, it was dark, and the doctor had no idea whether it was night or day. He fumbled for his flask tucked inside his coat and took a small sip of a strong Petersburg vodka, feeling the burn in his throat. He shuddered. The alcohol warmed him only for an instant. I'm about to freeze, he thought. I'm about to freeze and I'll never reach this damn Bergen. The wind was striking the thin walls of the vehicle, laughing grimly. The doctor glanced at his watch. In the weak light of the swaying lantern hanging from the ceiling, the digits on the porcelain dial blurred and danced. He struggled to focus his gaze. 3 hours had passed since the last change of horses. Not that long, then. The young man sitting across from him gently tapped his knee. We'll soon be there, he said in German, confirming Skórzewski's tentative hopes. We're already on the outskirts. How do you know? Skórzewski asked, surprised. We've just descended into the valley. Please listen to the wind. Indeed, the gale howled unimpeded. The area around the carriage must have been flat and open. How can you endure this? Pavel asked. We're used to it. Besides, it's not that cold, just -15 Celsius. Skórzewski heard a strange sound. It took him a moment to realize those were his own teeth clattering. This is Norway, his fellow passenger said with a smile. A bad place to visit in winter. He had to agree. And after all, he'd been warned. He could have stayed in Oslo. He could have waited for the thaw. But he set off, hundreds of kilometers through high mountain passes. He was already a week behind schedule due to snowstorms. He closed his eyes, and exhaustion immediately overtook him. He dreamed. Fields of ripe grain swayed gently in the summer breeze. A wonderfully warm sun shone in a clear blue sky. He woke the moment the carriage came to a stop. The passengers crowded toward the exit. An icy stream of air rushed in through the open door. With effort, the doctor pushed off the reindeer hide and donned the warm camel-hair traveling coat he'd been sitting on. He covered his head with a caracal papaka. Slowly, cautiously, he stepped outside. The skin on his cheeks immediately began to sting. He took a few breaths, gradually bringing himself to life. He looked around, his eyes watering from the cold. A snow-covered driveway. Horses, utterly exhausted, draped in heavy blankets. The driver, clad in a thick bearskin coat, nimbly jumped down from the box. A young man in uniform was unloading trunks and packages from the roof. In front of the wooden station building a sign swayed slightly in the wind, Bergen. The doctor glanced at his luggage. He had no idea how far it was to the hospital. He would need to hire a sled. Unexpectedly, someone shook his hand firmly. Armauer Hansen, he heard. I thought I'd come meet you, my dear colleague. Welcome to Bergen. Pleasure to meet you. Paweł Skórzewski, he replied, struggling to keep from biting his tongue as his teeth chattered like a mousetrap. He raised his head with effort. Dr. Hansen didn't look his 35 years. His face was darkened by sun and frost, and his blue eyes burned with an unusual intensity. I see, my dear colleague, that the journey has taken its toll, Hansen said with concern. The hospital is 2 streets away. We'll be there in no time. He loaded Skórzewski's 2 trunks and a corner-reinforced suitcase onto a light sled he had brought with him. Apologies for being late. No trouble at all. I assumed you were held back by snow. Sometimes the route is impassable for weeks. But they promise the railway will reach us in 10 years. What are winters like in Poland? He asked. Much warmer, Skórzewski stammered, his teeth still chattering. And the wind isn't as fierce. And this polar night. His host smiled faintly. Let's not exaggerate. Here in Bergen, we don't have polar nights. It's just that twilight falls at 2 in the afternoon. They entered among buildings. Despite the darkness and his watering eyes, Pavel noticed that all the houses lining the street were made of wood. Painted white or pale green, they gave off a somber impression. The walls were covered with thin, overlapping planks, reminding him of the construction of clinker-built boats he had seen during his practice in Polesia. Light seeped through many windows. Inside, people sat by warm fireplaces, drinking coffee, talking, or playing with their children. He clenched his teeth and, to distract himself at least partially from reality, began counting his steps. 2,586. A kilometer and a half. Soon they stopped by a small gate. In the gloom, he made out a wooden tower rising nearby. The hospital chapel, his host explained. A guard bundled in a sheepskin coat let them in without a word. Dr. Hansen took both trunks as if they weighed nothing, slinging one onto each shoulder. The traveler grabbed his suitcase and followed. The hospital building surrounded a sizable courtyard on 3 sides. On the 4th, by the street, the small wooden chapel completed the quadrangle. They entered the courtyard. About a meter of snow covered the ground. Only a narrow path had been cleared from the gate to the entrance doors and generously sprinkled with ash. Hansen moved like a ballerina, balancing the trunks. One was significantly heavier, making it difficult for him to keep his balance. Skórzewski hauled his suitcase through the snow, too exhausted to carry it. In one corner of the courtyard, a few bundles wrapped in grey cloth lay covered in frost. He sensed death with a sixth sense. "We can't bury or cremate bodies in weather like this," the Norwegian doctor said. "For now, they remain frozen in the snow. Once spring arrives, we'll transport them to the cemetery outside the city and cremate them." The door opened with a slight creak, and they found themselves in a spacious vestibule. The air smelled of boiled meat and burning wood, but these pleasant aromas were undercut by the stench of carbolic acid, ether, and decomposing bodies. They turned left and climbed narrow, creaking stairs to the upper floor. The air was wonderfully warm. Skórzewski felt life returning to him. His heart beat strongly and steadily. He could feel his fingers again. Hansen pushed open another door, and they entered a small, tastefully furnished sitting room. Without effort, the doctor set the trunks down on the floor. He turned a valve and lit the gas lamp. The room basked in a pleasant light. "This is the guest room. The bathroom is next door. I'll bring dinner shortly." The guest gratefully shed his frost-stiffened coat and thick sweater. He pulled off his heavy, fur-lined boots and stretched out comfortably in an armchair, absorbing the warmth and light with every fiber of his being. The Norwegian returned after a moment. He carried a pitcher of coffee, a platter with meat and smoked fish, and a small tray of bread. Skórzewski eyed the meal with unease. "Dr. Danielson is unfortunately already asleep," Hansen said. "He's had a hard day today." They sat beside the small table. The first bite turned out to be unexpectedly hard to swallow. Skórzewski felt the salmon sandwich to petrify in his mouth. Eat here? In such place? Panic started to overwhelm him. Wild, primal, animal-like fear. He knew that probability of infection is minimal. He knew that most likely the disease is not transmitted by food. And yet, he couldn't control his reflex. Hansen noticed what was going on as he patted his shoulder in a calming gesture. "Do not be afraid. We have our meals delivered from the city." Skórzewski suddenly felt relief. The food has regained its taste. He sighed. "Here we cook only for the sick," the host explained. "Anyway, we'll have plenty of time tomorrow. I'll show you around." Skórzewski nodded. The warmth has cozied him completely. The hardships of travel have taken their toll. Hours, days, and weeks spent on an uncomfortable bench of the carriage, frost, small sips of alcohol gulped almost incessantly for the last few hours. His eyelids felt like lead. "Excuse me," he said. "I think I need to go to sleep." Hansen smiled, understanding. He finished his coffee and left. Pavel slowly loosened his tie and looked out through the window to the narrow alley bordering the hospital from this side. The window glass was very thick, covered with frost flowers, but through a small breath-thawed surface he noticed someone standing on the other side of the alley. The figure wasn't tall, at times disappearing in the snowfall completely, to later emerge again and be visible in more detail. The stranger's face was covered in a dense shadow, but the doctor suddenly felt as if the man was staring straight at his window. He reflexively backed into the depth of his room, and when he looked out again, the alley was empty. Only the wind made the snow dance around the pavement. 2 minutes later the doctor slept as a baby, cuddling his head against a soft pillow full of goose feathers. Somewhere between the roof's beams rats chased one another. The gale had weakened slightly, but the frost grew fiercer. The doctor woke up at dawn. For a moment, he lay still, trying to remember where he was, when unexpectedly a moan reached his ears. The sound, which had likely pulled him from his sleep, pierced through the walls and ceilings, coming from somewhere deep within the building. A groaning man was dying. Pavel reluctantly pulled himself out of bed and lit a candle. His clothes hung on the back of a chair, but he hesitated for a long moment, debating whether he should go or stay in the room. Finally, his sense of duty prevailed. He descended the creaking stairs to the ground floor. From the vestibule, he turned left and found himself at the end of a long corridor. A narrow beam of light shone from beneath one of the doors. He knocked. "Come in," came a reply in Norwegian from inside. The smell of death hit him, a horrific stench of decomposing flesh. He stood in the doorway for a moment, steeling himself before stepping inside. Hansen was sitting on a small stool beside a patient. In the back of the room, at a small table, an older doctor was filling a syringe with a white, cloudy liquid. The patient lying in the bed clenched his teeth. The doctor approached, pulled back a corner of the blanket, and deftly inserted a needle into a thick vein in the man's arm. For a moment, Skórzewski caught sight of the dying man's hand, devoid of fingers, covered in lumps and discolorations. The tissues were dissolving, and the wounds refused to mend. The leper closed his eyes, and after a few minutes, relief spread across his face. Only then did the Pole notice that both doctors were wearing thin, thread gloves on their hands. Daniel Danielson, the grey-haired man, introduced himself, setting the syringe down on the table. "You'll forgive me, my colleague, for not shaking hands, but in our craft, this gesture has oddly fallen out of use." He spoke German in an amusing way, drawing out and softening some of the endings. "Paweł Skórzewski," the guest replied with a smile. "Morphine," Hansen explained, noticing Skórzewski's questioning glance. "A new drug with powerful anodyne effects." "We're familiar with it," Paweł responded. "But we still much more frequently administer orally opium." "Opium?" Danielson asked in surprise. "Laudanum," Hansen clarified for him. "I hope, Sir Doctor, that you have received my letter of recommendation from the St. Petersburg Medical Society?" Skórzewski inquired. "Indeed I have. I'm very pleased to have you here. The exchange of experience will benefit you both," he said, gesturing toward Hansen. "Agony?" Pavel asked, glancing at the patient. "Yes. An exceptionally nasty case. 6 months, and then death. He won't live past tomorrow. Take a look at the ulcer wounds. They faded and closed partially?" Skórzewski asked to confirm. "I recognize these symptoms. They indicate the end is near. We'll have to perform an autopsy," Hansen added. "It's rare for leprosy to strike internally. In this particular case, I believe the kidneys and liver have been affected. Please notice the spots on his face and hands." Skórzewski nodded, acknowledging the diagnosis. Unexpectedly, the patient opened his eyes wider and looked directly at him. His gaze was unfocused. "Catch him and kill him," he said with complete clarity, before his gaze extinguished like a snuffed candle. The man's face seemed to collapse inward, his muscles relaxed, and the strange grimace that had twisted one corner of his mouth disappeared. His lower jaw slowly fell slack. Dr. Hansen closed the dead man's eyes. "Was he in pain?" Skórzewski asked, pulling out a small notebook. "Yes. But he lost sensation in the affected organs. Lepra always attacks the nervous system first. You should get some rest," we'll perform the autopsy tomorrow. The Pole returned to his room. He washed his hands and hair thoroughly, but couldn't shake the intrusive feeling that the disease had clung to his skin. He knew the risk of infection was minimal, but he couldn't suppress his fear. As he prepared for bed, he once again noticed a dark figure on the sidewalk across the street. He closed his eyes to dispel the illusion. When he opened them, there was only swirling snow being driven by the wind across the pavement. "Damn mirages," he muttered. A late winter morning dispelled the nocturnal phantoms. Skórzewski stood in the doorway, breathing deeply, letting the icy air fill his lungs. Across the street, the ground rose into a forest. A granite massif towered above the town. The courtyard was orderly, except for one corner where another elongated shape lay under the wall. The grey cloth was speckled with darker stains, blood that had seeped through when it was carried. Frost was already forming on its surface. The doctor set off along the ash-covered path and entered the building. A small vestibule, its floor paved with stone slabs, greeted him. Several doors led off from it. Which one should he knock on? He heard footsteps and turned to see Armauer descending the stairs. "Good morning. I find my colleague already awake. Apologies, I think I overslept." But not at all. After such a journey, doctor needed rest. "Danielson and I performed the autopsy this morning." "And the results?" "Indeed, there were unusual infiltrations in the liver. We've preserved samples in alcohol, we'll examine them more closely later. For now, come with me." Hansen pushed open a sturdy oak door secured with several iron bolts. They entered a large, 2-story-high room. To the right, a row of doors led to small private rooms. Patients shuffled along the walls, while a few sat at a table reading or listening to an older woman who was reading aloud from the Bible. A gallery ran around the room, with access to the chambers on the upper floor. "There are currently 80 patients here," the host explained. "Some can no longer move, we've placed them downstairs. Us apart, 5 staff members help care for them." "Is that enough?" "Our biggest challenge is the frequent changing of dressings. We also try to provide the patients with some entertainment, essential for fighting apathy, but most of them are illiterate." The sick, hearing voices near the entrance, slowly turned their faces toward the doctors, gazing at them with melancholy. Skórzewski shuddered involuntarily as he saw the growths, swellings, and wounds on their faces. Hansen led him back into the vestibule. "It's hard to get used to," Hansen sighed. "But what's even worse for me is knowing that all of them are essentially already dead. They're still walking, still thinking, but in reality, they're gone." He snapped his fingers. Since the founding of this leper house, research has been ongoing into various treatments. And still without success? "We haven't lost hope." They entered a small laboratory. Dr. Danielson sat at a microscope, thoughtfully peering through the eyepiece. "How are the histopathology results?" Armauer asked. The older doctor slowly nodded, replaced one slide with another, and jotted down his observations in a notebook. "They're everywhere. In the kidneys, the liver, the intestines are practically clean." "You were right, it struck internally." "Could you explain in more detail?" Skórzewski asked. "Of course," Danielson replied with a smile. "The patient who died last night suffered from one of the variations." "There are no variations," Hansen interrupted. "It's always caused by the same bacteria." The older man nodded, reluctantly conceding the point. "He suffered from a relatively rare form of leprosy. Usually, we deal with fully symptomatic lepra. The patient's body develops patches of skin insensitive to pain, thickenings, lumps, and eventually non-healing wounds. But sometimes, the disease strikes internally." From a cabinet, he took out a jar containing a kidney immersed in slightly yellowed alcohol. "Take a look." Leprosy infiltrated this organ, following the path of the nerve fibers. The tissue partially decomposed. Typically, lepra eats away at a person for months, only to unexpectedly break outward within weeks, manifesting the full-blown disease. Since it attacks the nerves first, the patient usually doesn't feel pain. "Yesterday?" "As I mentioned, that poor soul was a bit of an exception. The bacteria damaged his internal organs, impairing their functions. The pain was caused by systemic poisoning with calcium oxalate and urea. "Do take a look through the microscope, please," he encouraged. Skórzewski removed his glasses and looked. He saw a sample that appeared to be a fragment of spinal nerve tissue. In many places, small, dark, rod-like structures were visible. They moved sluggishly. He was seeing them for the first time in his life. So this was what he would be fighting against. "That is our enemy," Hansen explained. "They're still alive?" "Isolated, even 2 days after the patient's death. Carbolic acid, alcohol, and high temperatures kill them. We're experimenting with various substances to study their survivability. Our doctors, upon hearing about your discovery, attempted to replicate your observations, but they failed." Danielson smiled bitterly. "Did they admit which part of our method they disregarded?" "Judging by your expression, Doctor, I see my colleague is oblivious. We simply bathe our samples in a solution containing a trace of ink. Leprosy bacteria absorb the dye more effectively than other tissues. It's an invention of our dear Armauer." Hansen smiled sheepishly, but a glimmer of pride shone in his eyes. "I came upon it entirely by accident," he admitted. "Staining samples is considered unscientific by most schools," Skórzewski remarked. "In Russia, it's outright banned." "Yes, we've heard about that. But since it works. For us, practical results matter more than accusations of medical quackery or malpractice," Danielson said with a wry smile. Pavel once again peered through the microscope's eyepiece. The bacteria seemed to be moving a bit more sluggishly. "How long do they survive outside the host?" he asked. "I mean, in tissue samples." "Around 7 or 8 days. However, I suspect they could last longer in favorable conditions," Hansen replied. "Have you observed them reproducing?" "Unfortunately, no. Either they can't do so when the patient is dead, or they reproduce too slowly for us to observe," Danielson interrupted. "Given the very long incubation period, that's not out of the question." He pushed open the door at the far end of the room. Inside a small chamber, a few sizable animals moved about on a layer of sawdust. At the sound of footsteps, sharp snouts turned toward the door. "Armadillos," Skórzewski remarked, astonished. "The key to solving the mystery of the disease," Armauer said solemnly. "This was observed in leper houses in Mexico. Human leprosy can only be inoculated in these animals. Here, we have healthy specimens. Those we've decided to infect are being kept in another part of the hospital for now. Unfortunately, the climate clearly doesn't suit them, and feeding them is problematic. They live on insects and small rodents." Outside, the wind chuckled. "In the afternoon, we'll go to Bergen," Hansen informed him. "You'll have a chance to observe practical aspects, Doctor." Pavel bowed his head. The patient sat on a chair before the 3 doctors. Half of his face was twisted into a grotesque grimace. "We have here a rather unusual symptom," Danielson explained. "Due to an infection in the nervous tissue, the right facial nerve has been paralyzed." Skórzewski put on gloves, dipped his hands into a bowl of carbolic acid solution, and carefully palpated the patient's head. "Indeed," he said. "We've seen similar cases in the Pskov Governorate." "And what did the doctors there recommend?" Hansen asked, curious. "Well, there aren't many doctors there, to be honest. Especially in the villages, people don't trust them. After the last cholera epidemic, they even concluded that doctors were the ones spreading the disease. We barely managed to pull one of my colleagues out of a well, alive, but only just. The folk healers, though, use 2 methods. The medieval one involves burying the patient up to their neck in earth or horse manure, hoping it will draw out the disease." "Absurd backwardness," muttered Danielson. "Let's not forget that some claimed lepra was hereditary," Hansen said with a smile. The old man was visibly ashamed. "The second method, more modern, involves soaking the patient for hours in nearly boiling water. They would write incantations on the barrel." "And did it work?" Hansen asked, a spark of interest in his eyes. Strangely enough, it did, at least temporarily. That's easily explained, Hansen said. According to our research, the leprosy bacillus dies at a temperature just slightly lower than what kills human tissue. If the temperature was precisely calibrated, the bacteria could partially die off while the human body barely endured. Of course, not all the bacteria would die, so the disease would eventually relapse. Perhaps if we could heat the human body uniformly to the right temperature, he trailed off, lost in thought. What should we do in this case? Pavel asked, pointing at the patient, who remained motionless on the chair. In theory, we could make an incision here. Danielson pointed with a pencil to a spot on the leper's face. Cutting both of the paralyzed nerves would nearly restore the face to its original appearance. But the benefit is minimal because it would result in bilateral paralysis. I see you gentlemen are using the latest advancements in medicine, Skórzewski remarked, examining a collection of bottles filled with carbolic acid. Hansen nodded solemnly. Dr. Lister's theories have been validated. Spraying carbolic acid around the surgical field drastically reduces complications. He dismissed the patient with a gesture. Shortly after, another entered. This one's nose had partially collapsed, giving his face an exceptionally repulsive appearance. Leprosy had also attacked his hands. Hansen said something in Norwegian, and the patient extended his arms. The wounds where his fingers had been had partially scarred over. The doctor took a long needle mounted in a wooden handle and carefully prodded the stumps. Not good, he said. Conservative treatment is ineffective. What did you try? Pavel asked, taking out his notebook. A quinine-arsenic compound. At first, the bacilli seemed to retreat, but now they've apparently adapted to the altered conditions. The wounds are reopening. Osteolysis? Skórzewski inquired. Exactly. Osteolysis. The phalanges disintegrate into fragments. Normal tissue is replaced by something resembling cartilage. Like this. Danielson pulled a glass box containing dissected hand bones from a drawer. Perhaps the calcium loss could be slowed down, the Pole suggested. Oral supplements might help. Could you prepare them? Hansen's voice carried a note of interest. Of course. In that case, we'll put our laboratory at your disposal. You should find him and kill him, the leper said. I'm already dead, but you must stop him. He left the room. A collapsing nose, could he have previously suffered from syphilis? Skórzewski asked his colleagues. No. Sometimes leprosy attacks cartilage and mucous membranes. This leads to the destruction of the nasal septum and changes in the shape of the organ. Often, the bacteria travel along the olfactory nerves to the brain. When that happens, death follows within days. And has it ever happened that it attacked the eyes and traveled along the optic nerve? Not so far. Whom do they want to kill? The Pole asked curiously. Is someone intentionally infecting them? That seems impossible. The old doctor smiled faintly. A legend. A ridiculous legend. Nothing worth talking about. Hansen's expression suggested that he, for one, wanted to talk about it, but a pointed glance from his colleague effectively silenced him. We haven't been able to fully prove how leprosy is transmitted, Armauer said. We suspect it's through bacteria present in the secretions of the infected, so intentional infection, while very difficult, might be possible. We also don't rule out the possibility that the bacilli travel on droplets of vapor exhaled by the sick along with air, but that hasn't been confirmed yet. Pavel felt a cold bead of sweat slide down his spine. Armauer Hansen took his guest to a small, quiet eatery near the hospital. The establishment was set up in an old wooden house, with some walls removed, leaving supporting beams for the ceiling. When they entered, the room was nearly filled to capacity. It seems there's no free table, Skórzewski observed. Don't worry, soon there will be plenty, Hansen replied. Indeed, after a moment, the room began to empty, and within a few minutes, half the place was vacant. They sat at a newly available table. A waitress approached and handed them menus. Armauer ordered reindeer goulash and fish soup. The girl quickly disappeared. Why did they leave so suddenly? The Pole asked, intrigued. Hansen smiled broadly. Take a guess. Pavel pondered for a moment, then shrugged. Of course, it's because they consider us unclean, avoiding us like diseased, infected animals, Dr. Hansen explained nonchalantly. But it's understandable. Won't the restaurant owner call for help from some neighbors and throw us out? No. I am the owner. This is the only place in Bergen where I can eat in peace. In other restaurants and taverns, I would indeed be immediately asked to leave. There's nothing like a bad reputation, he sighed. You haven't achieved significant results in treatment so far. Pavel returned to his pressing questions. The quinine arsenic preparation didn't work, but that doesn't mean the next one won't. I've developed a new formula based on mercury. Its chemical composition is somewhat similar to the agent used to treat syphilis. That severely damages the body. The waitress brought 2 glasses of anise liqueur and small pâtés as appetizers. They clinked glasses over the table and drank, then took a bite of the pâtés. Dr. Arthur Muritz from the leper colony in Malachi attempted to treat patients by applying a preparation of aloe jelly and codeine. He achieved significant improvement in the condition of the wounds. Hansen continued the interrupted conversation. Perhaps it's worth a try? I'll try, but aloe is problematic. It can't be preserved, and it doesn't survive in our climate, not even in pots. My friends in America are trying to extract the compound from its stalks that accelerates healing processes. Maybe they'll succeed in making it storable. And what about ergotamine ointment? I'm not familiar with it, he said, intrigued. What's needed? Glycerin. You mix glycerin with wax and an ergot extract while heating. The results are somewhat promising, though we haven't achieved any significant success in leprosy treatment yet. The waitress brought the soup and quickly disappeared again. She really treats us like the plague, Pavel noted. Yes. A normal reaction, nothing surprising. Leprosy used to be seen as divine punishment for sins. Only recently have people begun to understand it's a disease. Even my principal understands that now. I saw how uncomfortable he got. Why did he react so strongly? Well, in his youth, he proposed a theory. That it was a familial plague. Danielson tried to inoculate himself with leprosy 20 times. Since he didn't succeed, he concluded it must be hereditary. He changed his mind after the introduction of the government prevention program. After isolating the sick in leprous area, cases of the disease still appeared in their families for 5 years. Then it stopped. 5 years is the incubation period, Pavel murmured. The soup was very tasty. In our climate, we've had cases of the disease appearing 2 years after infection or the presumed infection date. The doctors in Malachi claim that leprosy can incubate in the body for about 7 years. Perhaps race or climate plays a role. Are the Kanaka people of Hawaii more resistant? Hard to say. Probably not, since the plague brought by Chinese laborers is devastating them. The only difference is that it develops more slowly in their bodies. The waitress cleared the empty soup plates and brought the goulash. A moment later, the sound of breaking pottery came from the back. They're smashing the plates I ate from, Hansen said. It helps the customers feel a little safer. Now, where was I? Yes. The program required isolating all the sick and conducting periodic examinations of their family members and the inhabitants of villages where the disease appeared. We created special registries for each province. Initially, isolation brought remarkable results. In 1830, we recorded 2,000 cases, by 1850, only 1,200. In 1870, just over 300. 5 years later, it was 1,700. Skórzewski whistled. Such a sudden spike in numbers? How is that possible? We improved detection methods. My student, Nilsson, developed a certain test. We'd simply missed a lot before. At least, that's what I hope, Hansen muttered quietly in Norwegian, his tone turning pensive. Where did these new cases appear? Mostly here, in Bergen, he sighed. As if out of spite. Perhaps detection rates are highest near the research center? No. We've trained 200 doctors. We have lists of families whose members have suffered from leprosy over the past 70 years. All of them are examined once a year. Others are tested as well. Naturally, our efforts provoke significant resistance. People are scared. They finished their meal and had a glass of wine. Finally, they stood and headed for the exit. "You should finally find him and kill him," said an old sailor standing by the door. This time, Hansen lost his composure. "Nonsense," he shouted. Then he launched into a long tirade in Norwegian, speaking far too quickly for Skórzewski to catch even a fraction of the meaning. It was clear, however, that some of the words were insults. "Apologies," Hansen said once they were outside. "I just can't take it anymore. Who are we supposed to kill? What do these people want?" Pavel asked. "They've convinced themselves that when Dr. Danielson founded the Leprosy Research Center here, the demon of the disease came as well to investigate our work. They believe it roams the city and spreads infection. In truth, we recorded 20 new cases last year. This year, there are already 36. Have you tried to pinpoint the infections onto the city plan?" Pavel asked. There could be another factor at play. Maybe food contamination from a particular shop or a water supply source. Most of the cases have been recorded in the Bergen district. Almost all of them, actually. What kind of place is that? That's exactly where we're headed, Armauer replied with a smile. You'll see for yourself. They passed a church and emerged onto the waterfront. An icy, piercing wind blew in from the bay. Pavel pulled his sheepskin coat tighter around himself. Wooden, tall, and narrow buildings stretched along the side. The ground floors mostly housed shops, while lights in the upper windows indicated that people lived there too. An old port district, established back in the days of the infamous Hanseatic League, Hansen explained. This way, please. They turned into a narrow, wood-paved alley that cut between the houses. They walked farther and farther until they entered a side street. Before them, passageways and corridors opened up, leading deeper into the maze. Our hands are tied, Hansen said unexpectedly with a sigh. It's almost certain that a significant number of people living here are infected. If only we could gather them all in a square and examine them one by one. But no. Fortunately, more and more people are beginning to understand what leprosy really is. They stopped at a side entrance to one of the houses. Hansen knocked on the door, and it was opened promptly. The vestibule was rather dark, but after a moment, someone pushed open a door leading further into the house. In the next room, a dozen or so candles were burning. Lars Olafsen, fish trader, the host introduced himself, shaking Skórzewski's hand. There was no need for further explanation. The smell of dried cod had permeated even the walls. Paweł Skórzewski. A Russian, the merchant asked curiously. A Pole, Paweł corrected him with dignity. A doctor, Hansen explained. He came here to learn our methods for fighting the disease. Come on in. They climbed a narrow staircase to the upper floor. The interior of the house was a maze of small rooms and staircases leading up and down. In every room, the floors and ceilings had small wooden hatches installed. What's all this for? Skórzewski asked. In case of fire, the owner explained seriously. He spoke German almost without an accent. 100 years ago, fire consumed most of the city. That's why almost every room has 2 exits. The houses are also connected, so if necessary, you can escape through a neighboring building. Pavel nodded and didn't ask anything further. They moved into a small room with a window overlooking the port. The host lit several candles, brightening the space. One wall had a built-in bed, hidden behind a panel that was currently raised. Another panel allowed direct access from the bed to what was presumably the next room. Even if fire caught them in their sleep, they were ready to escape. Skórzewski now understood why kerosene lamps were not used here. The hostess entered, a tall woman with a beautiful red braid, carrying a folding screen with a carved frame. She set it against one of the walls. Armauer took out several syringes, boxes with pins, a pair of thread gloves, and a basin from his bag. Over the flame of a spirit burner, he carefully sterilized the needles in their wooden mounts. "Please, let the first patients come in," he said to the merchant. "In that case, I'll go first." Lars smiled faintly, then disappeared behind the screen. A moment later, he emerged almost naked. Armauer observed him for a long moment. The merchant's skin was freckled, but otherwise, it showed no signs of concern. He nodded. "You're fine." Olafsen got dressed and left. Moments later, his wife appeared. She undressed, standing before the doctors in just her undergarments. On her shoulder blade was a peculiar pink mark. Hansen studied it for a moment before reaching for a needle. "That's an old burn scar," she protested. "Dear colleague." Hansen addressed Pavel, "Please make a few punctures, 3 millimeters deep." He stood in front of the woman, his gaze fixed on her face. Skórzewski passed the needle over the candle flame and gently pricked her skin. She squeaked. He repeated the procedure in another spot. This time, she let out a quiet cry. "Pupillary response confirmed," Hansen said calmly. It did hurt her. Of course it hurt, she groaned in Norwegian. "Torturers." "Please don't be offended," Hansen tried to smile. "We had to make sure." After a moment, the host's 15-year-old daughter took her place. She was very shy, but the doctor quickly waved his hand dismissively. There were no suspicious marks visible on her body. Next came a young servant girl, perhaps 13 years old. On her small, undeveloped chest, there were several tiny, whitish spots. Hansen carefully pricked them with a pin. The girl didn't even flinch. He bit his lip. "We'll do an additional test," he said to Skórzewski. He took a small brush from his bag and applied a dark liquid to the girl's skin. "That's iodine tincture," he explained. "Now, we'll dust it with potato starch." From a nickel-plated box, he took a syringe and drew a small amount of some substance from a bottle. "We'll inject 1/10 of a cubic centimeter of a 1% pilocarpine solution under the skin." Pilocarpine induces intense sweating. Under the influence of salty sweat, iodide will precipitate, producing characteristic black or dark brown dots on the powdered skin. The servant's chest became covered with tiny black specks. The Norwegian smiled at her. "No need to be scared anymore," he said. "You're healthy." "Thank God," she whispered softly. "What exactly does this test check?" Pavel asked, not understanding. "Leprosy-affected skin doesn't sweat," Armauer explained. The servant dressed and disappeared. In came a boy who worked transporting packages from the warehouse to the office. As soon as he removed his shirt, Hansen's face darkened. Large spots covered most of the boy's back. The affected areas were swollen and discolored. The doctor used the pin again. The boy hissed in pain each time he was pricked. "It's some variant of dermatitis," Hansen murmured. "We'll prescribe zinc ointment, but..." He performed the iodine tincture test and finally cut out a small piece of skin, placing it in a tin box. "You should get him," the boy muttered as he left. The last of the long line of examinees was an older cook. Judging by her ample figure, she had likely sampled most of the dishes she prepared. Her skin was quite freckled with moles, but nothing suspicious was visible. "People at the market say Elder Leprose is out in the city again," she remarked as the examination ended and she dressed behind the screen. "You need to catch him." "Elder Leprose," Hansen sighed. "People saw him. A few days ago, at dusk, he walked through the fish market. He was heading toward Bergen." "It's just a myth. Maybe there really is a vagrant with leprosy wandering the city who should be caught, but he has nothing to do with the plague." "I know," she sighed. "It was here, in this city founded by German merchants, that the plague from the Levant first appeared. That's why he came here. He feels most at home among the wooden houses. Everything looks as it did when he first arrived. He wears a wide, leather hat, like a merchant from Hanseatic times. They say all that's left of his face are his eyes. Maybe you need a priest for this, of course, a Catholic priest." "Wonderful," Hansen muttered. "If that's the case, how am I supposed to kill him?" You can't catch a ghost. You were the first in the world to observe leprosy bacteria, doctor. Maybe soon you'll come up with a cure. She smiled. He's afraid of you. He hates you. He'll follow you. Maybe one day, the plague will touch you. The doctor shuddered. Let's go, he said to Skórzewski. This house, fortunately, is completely clean. Dusk had fallen. Hansen took a small lantern from his bag and lit the candle inside. They walked through the alleys, paved with weathered wood. If ghosts truly lived in this city, they'd reside here, Hansen said, looking at the steeply rising walls around them. By day, this place must look charming, Pavel observed. But now, it really does feel. A patrol emerged from the shadows. Good evening, Dr. Hansen, the leader said. Will you need an escort? He cast a glance at Skórzewski. No, thank you, we didn't find anyone today. The patrol leader smiled faintly. 2,586 steps, he said. We're keeping an eye on everything. Maybe we'll finally catch him. Superstitions, Hansen growled. The patrol disappeared into the dark alleys, and only the creaking of boots on the ice-covered wooden planks echoed between the warehouse walls. What was that part about the steps? Pavel asked, intrigued. People believe that anyone being escorted always walks 2,000 and something steps between their home and the hospital. Being escorted, so hospitalization is mandatory? Unfortunately, yes. I'd prefer not to enforce it, but what can I do? I have to cut off sources of infection. And don't your patients ever escape? Skórzewski asked with a hint of sarcasm. Sometimes they do. But it's rare. Families can visit them, they talk, though only through glass. And if they escaped, where would they hide? No one would take them in. Besides, escaping requires money. Occasionally it happens, he repeated. They hide in the countryside, but we usually find out where they are quickly. Still, I won't be chasing after them and dragging them back. I'm human, and so are they. Suddenly, a hunched figure loomed in the darkness ahead. From beneath a wide-brimmed hat, glowing eyes stared at them. Both doctors stopped, startled. A cascade of snow slid from a rooftop above the alley. For a moment, snowflakes swirled between the walls of the houses, and by the time they settled on the ground, the figure was gone. Did you see that? Skórzewski asked. Yes. Probably just a vagrant. I know what you're thinking. Yes, he did look like a ghost. I'll admit, hats like the one he had have not been worn for a good few decades, not since the Hanseatic League left the city. Skórzewski glanced at his colleague. Dr. Hansen's eyes were wide, his gaze clouded. Let's go, Pavel said, tugging Hansen's arm. Which way? Straight, then left. We'll end up at the waterfront. They moved on, supporting each other on the icy planks. They walked in silence. Skórzewski moved his lips quietly. Hansen smiled and began counting steps as well. They stopped in front of the hospital gate. 2,586, Skórzewski said seriously. I was counting too. I started later than you, and I got the same number, Hansen murmured. I've tried once before, he added quietly. They crossed the courtyard and entered the hospital. Dr. Danielson was waiting at the door. Oswald hanged himself, he said sadly. He couldn't take it anymore. Hansen smiled grimly, his expression tinged with melancholy. I haven't told you about that yet, he sighed. Sometimes patients escape in that way. The laboratory greeted them with the sharp smell of reagents. Skórzewski carried a trunk down from the upper floor. He opened it and pulled out a steel, nickel-plated box. I have a small gift here. Hansen opened the box and took out a dozen glass slides with samples. He placed the first one under the microscope and carefully adjusted the focus. A nice bacterial culture from a smear of human blood. Stained with something. Iodine. The work of a Pole, Dr. Tadeusz Browik. And what disease is this? Typhoid fever bacilli. Hansen opened a cabinet and deftly retrieved several bottles of preparations and chemical compounds. He measured precise amounts of each ingredient on a laboratory scale, poured them into a porcelain mortar, and began grinding them. Dr. Danielson entered. "We live in interesting times," he said as Hansen stepped aside to let him use the microscope. "Soon, we'll likely discover the appearance of other bacilli," Armauer replied. "In time, we may learn to destroy them by understanding how they are built." "You have a long, remarkable life ahead of you during the most pioneering years of medicine," Danielson sighed. "Such a shame I was born too early. Who knows, perhaps it will be you who develops a cure for leprosy. Would you care to look at these samples?" Skórzewski asked, pulling several jars of preserved human skin from his trunk. Let's take a look," Hansen said, examining the first jar. "Here we have leprosy in its classic form. Nodules, thickened patches. And here's the other variation, a smooth, reddish spot on the skin, likely numb to pain when the patient was alive. Do you have anything more interesting?" "Most are similar." "Show me." "This one is psoriasis, though very advanced. And this, some form of dermatitis, unrelated to true leprosy." "Ah, yes," he murmured, "the sample from Bergen." Hansen took a jar from his bag and used tweezers to extract a small piece of skin, cut from the boy's back. "This is skin cancer," Danielson said as he returned to examining the other samples. "Quite the collection. And here's leprosy again, this time striking internally. Barely visible on the skin, but deeper. Well, I'll leave you to it." He smiled and, taking a dish with a prepared sample, headed toward the part of the hospital occupied by the patients. "That boy is lucky," Hansen said, adjusting the microscope to view the sample. "No leprosy bacilli here." He opened the small furnace door in the corner and threw the sample into the flames. Suddenly, he froze, staring out the window. A figure stood in the hospital courtyard. Skórzewski saw it too. Moments later, it vanished with a gust of snow blown by the wind. "Again," Hansen said. Pavel nodded. "Let's speak honestly," Skórzewski requested. "All right. Since I became the head of this place 5 years ago, I've heard that story countless times. Elder lepros wandering the city. In Poland, during plagues, people would see a woman, the plague maiden. At first, I didn't believe those stories. I thought it was collective hysteria, superstitious nonsense from gossiping market women. But then I started seeing him, out of the corner of my eye, in dark doorways. I think he circles the hospital. He wants to know what we're doing. Maybe it was born long ago, feeding on human suffering, growing stronger until it began to take on a human form," murmured Skórzewski. "We Slavs have such stories. I used to hear them from my nursemaid when I was a child. She came from a village. A demon of disease. Almost tangible. Infecting people with leprosy, the very embodiment of the illness. Or maybe it's just the wind?" Hansen suggested. "I've only ever seen him in winter. The wind shapes ghosts from snow. They feed on our fear. But really, there's nothing there." "Nothing we could kill," Skórzewski said thoughtfully. "Why is it watching us? Maybe we're close to solving the mystery of the disease? Perhaps we need to use multiple treatments simultaneously, alkaloids and mercury. The patient's body wouldn't withstand that. But you're right that treating the external symptoms won't accomplish much. We need to strike at the core, along the nerves being consumed by the bacteria. But how? Perhaps injections of a 1% arsenic solution? Bacilli taken from deceased bodies don't survive long enough. But we could try. On the living. You think so?" Pavel pondered. "Sometimes a doctor must take risks. I wonder if the bacteria are present throughout the body or only in the affected areas. Probably throughout the body, but they're most concentrated in the affected areas." Hansen took a jar of arsenic from the cabinet. Carefully, he transferred a small amount of the white powder onto a dish, weighed it, and poured it into a flask of distilled water. "Let's go." They entered the main hall. The patients were slowly settling in for the night. A nurse was collecting empty bowls of porridge. They moved into one of the side cells. It was cramped, no more than 2 by 3 meters. Beds stood on either side of the entrance, but only one was occupied. The patient was awake, looking at the doctor. "How can I help you, doctors?" he asked, his voice hoarse. Leprosy had attacked his mucous membranes and was now eating away at his vocal cords. "I have a new medication here," the doctor said, lifting the flask. "It might work, but it could also be dangerous to your health. You want to test it on me?" The patient smiled. "I'm just an animal to you, a piece of meat to dissect. Where are the days when doctors inoculated themselves with plague or cholera to better study the progression and transmission of diseases? We won't inject it without your consent. Go ahead." He extended his deformed arm, covered in nodules. "I can't feel pain anyway." Hansen administered several injections, each containing a quarter cubic centimeter of the solution. "That's enough," Skórzewski stopped him. "Don't forget, 1/3 of a gram of arsenic suffices to kill." "So, it's arsenic you're injecting me with," the patient said, nodding. "And I used to poison rats in the cellar with it. Drop by in the morning. If I'm still alive, I'll tell you if it helps." They returned to the laboratory. "I think I made a fool of myself," Hansen muttered. "If there's no sensation in his arm, it probably means the nerves are already gone. But we had to try. A demon of disease," Pavel sighed. "For now, it seems to have the upper hand. In the end, it has to lose. If I don't find the right cure, others will." Skórzewski suddenly felt very tired. "Time for bed," he said. He climbed up to his room and washed thoroughly. The smell of decaying flesh refused to go away, as if the dreadful stench had seeped into his skin. Before falling asleep, he looked out the window. The alley was empty, only the wind was pushing snowdrifts along the street. They were having breakfast at the restaurant. The day was nice, the wind had calmed, and the sun had come out. "We made fools of ourselves last night," Dr. Hansen said as he spread butter on a slice of bread. "Why?" "Even if the arsenic injection kills the leprosy, the cells in his skin and bones, and likely his muscles too, are already too severely damaged. We'll give him a calcium preparation according to my formula and gelatin to strengthen the cartilage and connective tissues, along with cod liver oil for overall improvement. Mayhap if some of the cells remain healthy, they'll multiply. We'll see." At that moment, Dr. Danielson burst into the restaurant. "Dear colleague," he addressed Armauer, "it seems there's another case of leprosy in town." Hansen grabbed the unfinished sandwich from his plate and wrapped it in a napkin. Skórzewski quickly downed his coffee. He didn't like the taste. Here in Norway they boiled their coffee instead of brewing it, but it still helped chase away his gloomy thoughts. "Where did it happen?" Hansen asked as they hurried out. "At the boarding school." "God have mercy." Hansen took only his medical bag from the hospital, and moments later, they were running, slipping on the snowy streets. Dr. Danielson stayed at the clinic. Soon, they reached a large building housing the boarding school. A grim-faced woman with a fierce, combative expression greeted them at the door. "Take her away," she screamed hysterically. "Plague! Please calm yourself." Hansen shouted back. "The children are watching." "Where is she?" She waved her hand in the direction of the courtyard. They entered through the gate into a small yard surrounded by sheds. Standing in front of one of them was a porter armed with an old cap and ball rifle. Hansen sneered at the sight, pushed him aside, and opened the door. In the corner sat a huddled girl, about 16 years old, dressed in a simple dress and leather slippers. She looked at him like a trapped animal, her terrified face contorted. "Take her away," wailed the headmistress, who had followed them. Hansen turned to her sharply. "It's -15 outside, and you've put her in a shed, dressed only in a thin dress," he shouted. "Have you lost your mind? Bring her a coat, a hat, and boots immediately." He stepped into the shed. The girl shrank back even further in fear. "Don't be afraid," he said gently. "I'm a doctor." My name is Armauer Hansen. She seemed to have come to herself instantly, or perhaps she was just numbed by shock. I've heard of you, she said, turning as pale as a sheet. My name is Vanya. Vanya, London. Pavel introduced himself as well. After a moment, the porter returned, carrying Vanya's clothes on a pitchfork. He tossed them onto the dirt floor, retreated to a safe distance, and began disinfecting his throat with anise liqueur. Hansen helped the girl get dressed. Are we going there? She asked. Yes, but don't worry. I'll find out what's really wrong with you. It might be nothing. The porter came back, again using the pitchfork, this time bringing her suitcase. As they were leaving, the headmistress was outside in the courtyard, dousing Vanya's mattress and bedding, thrown from the window, with kerosene. Don't forget to scrub the walls and floors with boiling water, Hansen advised her with mock kindness. And, of course, you should burn this shed as well. His eyes gleamed mischievously. He had no doubt she would follow his advice. They left. Just beyond the gate, Hansen stopped abruptly. We can't walk her through the entire city in full view, he said. Even in case it's not leprosy, people will stigmatize her just for being seen with us. Let's take a sled, suggested Skórzewski. As if anyone here would accept me as a passenger. Perhaps the undertaker with his hearse. No, we'll do it another way. You two go to the hospital. I'll take a roundabout route. No one here knows you yet. Pavel smiled faintly. The two of them set off together. Will you let me escape? She asked in German. He felt as though he'd been struck on the head with an axe butt. Forgive me, she said. Maybe it's nothing. Besides, the doctor is somewhere behind us, and without money, I wouldn't make it back to my village. He nodded. You would let me, she said with unexpected certainty. Let's count the steps. Some say there would be 2,583. 86, he corrected her. And we've already walked part of the way. Let's count. They walked in silence, counting. Vanya was very pale, and her knees seemed to weaken slightly. She walked slowly, but the hospital loomed ever closer. Hansen followed a good distance behind them, counting as well. It matches, she whispered as they stopped in front of the gate. That's impossible, Pavel said thoughtfully. The distance to the boarding school is much farther than to Bergen. We both got the same count, but I have longer legs and take larger steps. Maybe it's a sign, she said with a faint smile. So, this is what hell looks like. She touched the gate. Suddenly, her face twisted in fear, and tears welled up in her eyes. Skórzewski gently nudged her forward, opening one side of the gate. They stepped into the courtyard. In the corner, a shape wrapped in grey fabric hadn't yet frosted over, Oswald, who had hanged himself. Hansen caught up with them moments later. They entered the building through a door on the opposite side of the courtyard. Inside were a visitor's room, several staff quarters, and a secondary laboratory. Please wait here, Hansen said, running off and leaving them in the treatment room. Pavel glanced out the window. Hansen had reached the doors of the hospital chapel and dropped to his knees, praying. Vanya removed her coat and Pavel helped her hang it on a hook. He took off his own as well. Hansen returned shortly after. Undress, he instructed, gesturing to the privacy screen. A moment later, she stood before them in only her undergarments and socks, her cheeks flushed, eyes lowered. Where? Hansen asked. She turned, showing her back. It was covered in strange blisters, swollen with serous fluid. He took a pin and carefully pricked one of the areas. She squeaked. Just a little longer, young lady, he said. He pricked her a few more times. Each time, she flinched. Then he took a scalpel from the cabinet, sterilized it over the flame of a spirit burner, and excised a small piece of her skin. Pavel, familiar with the process, dissolved a small amount of ink in water to prepare the sample. You can get dressed now, he said. They prepared the specimen and placed it under the microscope. Hansen examined it closely. Then his colleague prepared another slide, and they switched. Together, they studied the bluish tissue under the lens. It was clean, with no sign of the rod-shaped bacilli. "You're healthy," Armauer said. "These sores look very similar to those caused by leprosy, but they are actually from eating bread made from contaminated flour. If it contains a lot of ergot, it can cause such skin irritation." "They appeared only recently," she said. "About a week ago. When you return to your village, they'll disappear in a few weeks." She smiled. "Wonderful," she whispered. Then her eyes rolled in opposite directions for a moment, and she collapsed to the floor. Pavel supported her on one side while Hansen held her on the other. They laid her on the examination couch and quickly brought some ammonia. She sneezed and opened her eyes. "So, I am healthy?" she asked to confirm. "Yes. Thank God. But how will I get home now?" she worried. "Where do you live?" "In Dale." Hansen pulled out his wallet and retrieved a few banknotes. "Pavel, hire her a sled and pay in advance." "Understood." "I'll write a letter to her parents," Hansen sighed, "because that hysterical woman will no doubt alarm the entire area. I wouldn't be surprised if this poor child has to continue her schooling in Oslo." He bid farewell to the almost patient, and Skórzewski left with Vanya. 2,586 steps, she said thoughtfully as she settled into the sled. "I wonder why. I'd like to know that myself. It's a shame there are no Jews in Bergen." "Why?" He smiled. "Experts in the Kabbalah can decipher hidden destinies or messages from numbers." "Maybe the numbers are telling you to kill him?" "Kill who?" "My classmates used to scare me with stories about a demon of disease haunting Bergen." "Silly jokes," she said, her tone turning serious. "There are no demons of disease. Such an evil spirit would have to wander the whole world endlessly." He made sure his words sounded convincing. From the inn where he hired the sled back to the hospital was half the distance to the boarding school, but once again, he counted 2,586 steps. "It's a cipher," said Dr. Skórzewski. "But we know too little to fully decode it. Number 2 corresponds to the Sephira Chokmah, while the 6 represents Tiferet." "And what does that mean in plain language?" Hansen asked, intrigued. "Chokmah is wisdom, Tiferet is beauty. Unfortunately, I don't remember the meanings of the other numbers." "This probably isn't the right path," Armauer sighed. And there he is again. On the street, something slightly darker than the surrounding gloom appeared, a dense swirl, woven from snow and the northern wind. "The leprosy spirit, the elder lepros," Pavel murmured in thought. Hansen opened a cabinet and took out several boxes. Opening the first, he revealed a mask carved from heavy, black wood. "This is a sculpture from Madagascar," he said. "It was sent to me as a gift by workers at a leprosarium there. And this is a carving of a disease demon from Benin, at the mouth of the Niger River." He handed Pavel another piece. "This one's Polynesian, from Dr. Muritz in Hawaii. Here's a woodcut depicting the leprosy demon from China, and this bas-relief was sent by a nun I know who cares for the sick in Calcutta. They're all the same. Or at least similar. As if modeled on a single prototype. And a rather unusual one. In leprosy, a common symptom is the so-called lion face. The thickening and swelling severely distort the features. But here, we see a rare form of the disease. The skin has been eaten away, and the nose has collapsed. Also, notice that in most cases of infection, the eyebrows fall out almost entirely. Here, on the left side, there's a small tuft of hair remaining. If I'm not mistaken, it's identically placed on all the exhibits. I've always tried to stay grounded in reality. But when you fight against such a horrifying plague, at some point, you start to feel that there's something, or someone, behind it. I'm not battling bacteria visible under the microscope but an alien, hostile mind. Maybe these people are right? Maybe it needs to be found and destroyed. How do you kill a spirit?" Hansen poured himself a glass of anise liqueur. "It can't be done." "It can," Pavel replied quietly. "You have to cast a silver bullet, engrave a cross on it, bless it, and load it into a weapon. That's how the old tales went where I grew up." Hansen looked him straight in the eye. You want some silver? He pulled a handful of worn, withdrawn silver coins from his pocket. I'll need some wax and a bit of clay as well. I'll make a mold, Pavel said, clenching the pile of coins in his hand. Winter was back. A snowstorm descended upon the city, accompanied by the eerie howling of the wind and temperatures plunging to 20 degrees below freezing. Skórzewski shivered over breakfast, sitting with the two doctors. The arsenic treatment is showing some effects, Dr. Danielson remarked thoughtfully. The leprosy bacteria are dying, but as the smear analysis shows, some of them seem not quite fully eradicated. They've shrunk and darkened, but haven't been completely destroyed. Maybe they've entered a kind of dormancy? Pavel suggested. Biologists at the Imperial Academy of Sciences have observed that microorganisms living in ponds shrink and appear to die off in winter, only to resume living and reproducing when conditions improve. That sounds plausible, Hansen noted. For now, we'll continue the arsenic injections. Let's see, perhaps they'll die off completely in the end. Arsenic is a dangerous remedy, the old doctor murmured. It causes more damage than mercury. But let's consider if we could mitigate its harmful effects on the body. Reduce the dose, Pavel proposed. Increase the dose, but for a shorter duration, Armauer countered. Or use zinc-based compounds, like those for treating syphilitic ulcers? Danielson mused. It's a dilemma. Do you remember that case from 2 years ago? Hansen asked unexpectedly. That boy, what was his name, Sigurd? Yes, I remember, Danielson replied. Listen, our dear guest, he said, turning to Skórzewski. A boy was brought to us, Sigurd, with mild changes on his skin. Practically invisible, but covering a considerable area. We examined them closely and found them to be leprosy. The bacilli were visible under the microscope, consuming the outer layers of the skin, but they hadn't penetrated deeper. He hadn't lost sensation in the affected areas either. After 6 months, the patches began to disappear. 3 months later, we couldn't find any bacteria in samples taken from his blood, skin, or muscles. We speculated at the time, Hansen added, that somehow the leprosy hadn't reached the nerve tissue and that his body managed to repel its attacks on the deeper layers. Maybe it was innate immunity, or perhaps it was a weaker strain of bacteria. Either way, the fact remains, he recovered. Perhaps, as with all diseases, a weakened body can't fight off the bacilli, but a strong one has a chance to overcome them. Pavel suggested, deep in thoughts. Dusk was falling as Pavel Skórzewski loaded his revolver with 5 silver bullets. They hadn't been blessed, there was no Catholic priest in the town, and he did not decide to visit the heretics. He descended to the laboratory, where Armauer was pondering another potential cure. Perhaps based on strychnine? He poured himself another glass of vodka. I figured out how to find him, Skórzewski said, showing him the weapon. Let's go. Hansen finished his drink and rose from his chair, setting aside a notebook densely filled with chemical formulas. Pavel also drank a little, for warmth and courage. They stood and stepped outside. The wind howled ominously, and the frost intensified. The sidewalks had suddenly become treacherously slippery. Where are we going? Hansen asked. Toward Bergen. Count your steps. But that's... Did it ever occur to you, Pavel interrupted, that it might work in the opposite direction too? If this spirit or demon actually has something to do with it at all. They set off into the darkness along Kong Oscar Gate. A ship was docked at the quay. I wonder where it's from? Pavel mused. A postal ship, probably from Oslo or Stavanger, Hansen explained. What's your count? 80 more. Same here. They turned onto a side street. The walls of the warehouses loomed dark, with only the faint glimmer of candles visible here and there on the 2nd or 3rd floors. The small paned windows let through very little light. 2,586, Skórzewski counted aloud. We are here. This is hopeless, Hansen sighed. Even if the distance is right, how do you know it's in this direction? It has to be. Otherwise, we'll never find him. You said yourself this is the oldest part of the city. This is where he first set foot on land. Hansen swept the lantern in a circle. The candle inside barely cut through the darkness. Suddenly, they saw him. He stood a few meters away, a grey, misshapen figure blending into the shadows. "What do you want?" he asked in a guttural voice. Pavel raised his weapon. "Your time has come," he said. He fired. The bullet missed, and the strange creature merely turned and moved into the dark tangle of alleys. Skórzewski pursued him, firing twice more. The fleeing figure staggered. The fourth shot brought him down. The black hood fell back, revealing a ghastly face ravaged by disease. It barely resembled a human anymore. Only the eyes were unmistakably human, filled with pure, hateful rage. He was still alive. "Hansen? Hansen," he rasped. "You?" Skórzewski raised his weapon one final time and pulled the trigger. In the flash of the gunshot, the monster was illuminated once more. They heard footsteps, and two gendarmes appeared in the alley. They shone their lanterns on the fallen figure. "You got elder lepros," one of them said, joy evident in his voice. "We were after him as well." "The epidemy's over?" "Drag this carcass out, it must be burned," Hansen ordered. They found an open spot on the quay. At a still-open shop, they bought a can of kerosene. A moment later, yellow flames roared skyward. Within minutes, all that remained was a small pile of ash and half-burnt bones. The gendarmes scraped the remains into the harbor channel with a snow shovel they had found. The ashes and bones hissed softly as they sank into the water. Among the ashes on the cobblestones, a few coins blackened by fire were left behind. They were walking back toward the hospital. "I understood when I saw the coins on the ground," Skórzewski said. "Why would a spirit or demon need money? And even if they did, why the worst, most worn-out pennies that had already been out of use? Dr. Hansen, I came here to gain experience in fighting this disease, and instead, I likely just killed an innocent leprous beggar who had the misfortune of crossing our path in one of Brigand's alleys. It had to have been an ordinary man. I lost my head over stress, the darkness, and the vodka." They stopped in front of the hospital gate. "Did you count the steps?" Dr. Hansen asked. "No." 3,275.